Our first workshop is very exciting. It is called Building a Stronger Workplace Through Diversity and Inclusion. It's a 3-part series with very gritty advice for attracting and advancing millennials. First, there will be 3 sections. The first one will be Linda Duyle, the second one will be Jennifer Marrapese, and the third one will be Charles Baldwin. Now I'd like to introduce Linda Duyle and Kaylee Carmel. Linda is founder and president of Dulye Company. She offers proven portable techniques for growing your network and reputation with the under 40 talent pool. I, for one, sign into her Friday leadership meetings where I've met Kaylee, and it is blockbuster. If you have not been on a Dulye Leadership Friday breakfast call, you are missing out. And you will see in action today how Linda and Kaylee orchestrate conversations and keep it moving forward. So right now, I'd like to turn it over to Linda and Kaylee, and let me just let you know that Kaylee is the executive and office manager at 18 Degrees Family Services for Western Massachusetts, based in Pittsfield. She's also on the advisory board of the Dulye Leadership Experience. And Linda's background includes multiple leadership roles in General Electric, Allied Signal, Duracell, Gray Advertising. But as I said, Linda is a force in the Berkshires. She nurtures and gives power and voice to these millennials that are really all of our future. And with that, welcome Linda and Kaylee. Have a great workshop.
Good morning. I love the intro. Love the energy. Thank you, Eileen. Thank you, Liana. And thanks to your terrific team and your multi-generational board as well for expertly rising to tackle this virtual programming challenge, which is a mighty feat. And also for kicking off day 2 with this vital topic. I am honored to be on the speaker crew and to share insights on a crucial imperative for the success of every organization that's represented by our attendees today. Millennial talent, how to attract it, how to advance it. So I'm going to start with you and your feedback. This 10-second poll that you're seeing Kaylee show has become a standard Dulye leadership experience, not the question, but the poll practice. And we develop a simple yes or no question about a timely trend or issue that we gather and gauge insights on. And this is a very portable practice. You can easily adopt it. But for now, I would like for you to take a few seconds. I would like you to answer the poll using the feature at the bottom of your screen. And that's going to be asking you the question, at present, the executive board at my organization includes at least one member who is 35 years or younger. Okay, give you a second. And as Kaylee's going to be helping me, she's going to be scanning your responses. Let me just state on this chart my goal for the next 26 minutes or so. And it's to provide you with actionable strategies for you to absorb. And then once you've absorbed them, to share them with your team. These are timeless practices and very applicable, whether it's to COVID times or what's next. And while I'm speaking, Kaylee's going to be reading through and sorting your comments and questions in the chat box. Please keep them lively. We will have time for a Q&A exchange. So I've garnered these strategies not from theory, but from my corporate career. As you heard Eileen say, I worked for General Electric, Allied Signal, and Duracell, and also for my long-established career as a management consultant specializing in employee communication, employee collaboration, manager training, and executive coaching. And you can see on the chart the array of organizations that Dulye Company has proudly partnered with since 1998. Now, on the left side is another very significant contributing factor, and it's the work that I've done since founding and funding the Dulye Leadership Experience in 2008. And it is called the DLE. It's widely known as the DLE. It's a premier professional development program based right here in the Berkshires that is engaging hundreds of millennials and Gen Zers nationwide, and also some older. Eileen is an active member of our community. Me too. You're looking at the DLE advisory board, and that's Kaylee standing next to me. And as you can see, I'm the only one over 35. So a little known fact about me, or if you know me, it's not so little well known, is I tend to spend the majority of my time with people who are at least half of my age or more. Okay, so let's look at some vital data. Millennials are a force to be reckoned and leveraged in your organizations, as this research from the intelligence group shows. You need them for long-term success, yours and also for your organizations. Now let's see how prominent a force they are in your organization. So Kaylee, tell me what you see in the poll data.
I am waiting for PJ to share the poll, and as soon as it comes up, I will give you the data.
We have 18 of 23 that have voted. So I'll end the poll momentarily. If anyone else hasn't voted, please vote now.
Love having the data come in. Data is your friend always. In God we trust. Everyone run with data.
So I am seeing that 58% of the participants said yes, they do have someone aged 35 or younger, and 42 said no.
Okay, so it's great news. So many of you are making progress in raising the role of the millennials in your organization. And for the other organizations, the door of opportunity is wide open. So on this slide, you're going to see 3 essentials for attracting and advancing millennials in your organization. You need a transparent culture, and this is one where team members feel informed and involved about your organization's goals, operations, and performance. My firm calls this a spectator-free workplace. It's fueled by a daily current of open communications in multi-directions. Feedback is a permanent factor. It's not a rarity. It's not an event. Equally important is gratitude and having a workplace where team members are recognized verbally for their important contributions, as well as being offered extended growth opportunities in growth assignments that bring skills development and also networking. So lateral development is a powerful and often overlooked reward opportunity. So getting to this ideal state starts with you and taking a major step out of the comfort zone of the echo chamber that surrounds many of us. COVID has had an even greater cocooning effect, and you need to work harder in your outreach to connect with people whose ideas challenge the status quo. So back in the good old days before social distancing and work from home, I've attended many a chamber night, a gala, a networking event where I see segregated groups. I see senior leaders congregated with like kinds in one side. I see the same sort of setup with department managers in another side of the room. And then I see young professionals awkwardly standing or sitting in the wings. Don't squander networking opportunities. Get comfortable being proactive to connect with millennials anytime, any place, and now in any medium. So break out of the echo chamber to absorb different voices and views constantly from the millennials in your organization and those outside of it. Because if you ignore them, they will leave you. Now, a practice that will help you break free of the echo chamber is making conversations, and that is different than giving directions. Take action to engage millennial team members in open conversations about challenges, issues, problems, and decisions that have typically been reserved for the executive and senior manager ranks. Transparent cultures build ownership, not spectators wearing badges. Because if you keep them in the dark, they will leave you. Now we've got a tool for you, this personal interaction plan. And this template can help you establish a disciplined, open communication style where you initiate conversations through formal and informal interactions with one or many millennials in your organization or outside groups such as NPC. Now, I have seeded this chart with some examples of internal practices such as a reverse mentor session where you become the mentee to a millennial. Also skip level chats where you have multifunctional groups gathered and discussing a goal-aligned topic, and these being moderated by a millennial team member. And that's our format that we use for a bi-weekly program that we call the DLE Culture Chat. You are welcome to join in any of our DLE programs. They are free, and just go to the DLE website to find out how to get invited. You'll also see now in the right column of that template external practices, such as networking events sponsored, let's say, by your college alumni association, where you can go and meet new talents. Last week, I attended a virtual networking event that was sponsored by the New Jersey Alumni Association of my alma mater, which is Syracuse University, and there were numerous 35-year-olds logging on. That is a terrific outlet for attracting millennial talent. Of course, don't miss NPC special events or the DLE Virtual Breakfast Club that you heard Eileen talk about. Join us on Fridays. You can meet more than 30, more than 40 young and seasoned professionals from across the US and even beyond. And we exchange ideas and support about personal and professional growth. This DLE practice, this breakfast club, it started as a face-to-face exchange at a Pittsfield restaurant. It has exponentially expanded by going virtual. And that has improved our organization's programming because of the broad diversity of the participants we now attract. So take our model, run with it. Now, to make that interaction plan work, you need to do more than just show up. You need to do more than just show up physically or virtually. And while that's an important first step, you need to consciously turn up those listening skills and increase your intake. And by intake, I mean feedback, which is the gift of you learning about and from someone by shifting from one-way to two-way communications. Small talk is a very powerful practice for increasing your intake. We work on this skill heavily in our management training, in our DLE virtual programs. We start sessions with an open-ended question that's going to trigger everyone's engagement. For example, at a recent breakfast club, we asked attendees to show and tell in 60 seconds an unusual object in their work from home office. Now, the object that you're seeing, this happens to be in my office, and the visual is the nameplate that was on a vintage linotype machine that was used to set hot type in my mother's commercial printing business. An icebreaker exercise like this gets everyone talking and laughing, and it builds networks. There's another thing we do. We have a prepared question for everyone to answer to stimulate this exchange and also build camaraderie. For example, we've asked the question, what's one skill that you'd like to sharpen? And what's one skill that you can share with others? Try this in a one-on-one touch-based practice that's back on that personal interaction plan with some of your frontline millennial team members. There's another no-fail practice for increasing intake, and that's asking what questions. The quad tool you see here is one that my consulting firm uses to coach managers on how to engage every team member during their team meetings. The DLE Advisory Board uses it, and we use it to guide us in our strategic planning meetings, because silence isn't golden. No one gets a pass if you ask those 4 questions in the inquiry tool. And you can use one or all in the practices that you create in that personal interaction plan. And by the way, there's going to be a handout available that has that template of the personal interaction plan that's going to be made available after the summit by Liana and her team. Now, the really great thing about that 4S tool is that you don't know what you're going to be hearing because it's a what question. That might sound perilous to some of you, maybe frightening. Well, then it's time to shift, because uncertainty takes us out of our comfort zone. So change your mindset to see this surprising, unexpected feedback generated by what questions as a priceless gift to learn from. And I encourage you to often ask that question, what ideas do you have for improving our organization? Because if you don't ask for their help, they will leave you. And when you ask for questions and you're going to be asking for feedback, attend to your listening practices. Be mindful that your body language and tone don't stunt or silence different views. convey appreciation by resisting the looming temptation of multitasking, and consciously work on simmering that inner bias, particularly when you're hearing something very contrary to your belief. Demonstrate interest through your verbal and your visual cues. You want to be conveying receptivity and respect. And as you learn from your millennial talent, give them opportunities to put their ideas into practice. Recognize them with expanded, meaningful responsibilities on important internal programs and external outreach. Share the spotlight. For example, have them moderate a high-level meeting or a major donor special event rather than having the norm of the maybe same senior leaders doing so. The three millennials you see in this slide, that's Jesse Knoll on the bottom left, Marcus Coleman on the top left, and Allison Brigham on the right, and you saw her yesterday in the NPC Awards ceremony. They all took on the lead of planning and moderating major public programs produced by the DLE. I can assure you, there is joy, a tremendous joy, being in the backdrop, providing coaching, and watching these young professionals rise and soar. Trust me, this works. Recognition and responsibilities are craved by the millennial workforce. This is a consistent trend that we see in my company's measurement work. The chart you're looking at shows responses from a millennial survey group to the question, what keeps you engaged at work? And it's not about the mugs, it's not about the t-shirts. Okay, so time to hear from you. I'm going to break away, ask with Kaylee, with her help, to please share some of the feedback that's coming through the chat box. I'm going to leave this compilation of key takeaways. You can take a photo of it, although it will also be in the handout. So Kaylee, what are you seeing?
So there hasn't been any questions come through, but I did see a couple of people who really resonated. So maybe we can elaborate further on those ideas. One thing was, don't squander networking opportunities, being priceless advice. Maybe if you want to elaborate a little bit more on that.
So it's an interesting dynamic. I do get out in the old days, as I mentioned. I do get out and I go and I see, whether it's a One Berkshire or going to a nonprofit event, and there's a coagulation of the same folks that are probably talking with each other, leaders from different organizations at different levels, stratified but collected together, and young professionals just not knowing how to break into that, which is, by the way, one thing we do a lot of coaching on. How do you break the ice? How do you go approach that executive leader? But there has to be a little bit more curiosity on the part of our leaders and the part of our organization directors in terms of wanting to see and seize a young talent in the room, make them feel welcome, and approach them for their ideas. Both hearing from them, if they're not part of your team, where they're working, what their interests are, because it's very applicable to your own organization. So this curiosity, unleash it. Don't just go into that comfort zone of going and talking with the same people that you're probably going to be seeing, whether you're going to go and grab a breakfast at Otto's, or if you're not in the Berkshires, a local breakfast point where you're going to see everybody that's part of your nonprofit community or organizational community. This takes, it's not so much courage, this takes curiosity.
Great. So I had a question come through. You mentioned the importance of small talk. Do you have advice on how to succeed at that, particularly with colleagues who have different cultural and personal interests and backgrounds?
Yeah, I mean, you got to practice it. I really mean practicing it. So there's a coffee shop that I like to go to that is notorious for having a slow process. So you're going to inevitably wait in a line. These were in the days before masks. We're going to be waiting in line with masks 6 feet apart. But I notice that most people around have their heads looking down into this. And I make it a point, or made it a point, to put this away and strike up conversation with somebody either in front of me or in back of me. So I think a lot of this really starts with putting away this crutch, being able to break the ice with some small open-ended questions, and doing it on a repeated basis. Quite frankly, I set a goal for meeting at least 3 to 5 people a day through my LinkedIn exchanges. I also set that goal prior to COVID in meeting 3 to 5 new people every day by practicing small talk and breaking the ice. Setting goals is great, putting away the crunch of the device, it's okay not to have something in your hand, looking at somebody, approaching them and breaking the ice.
Great. Another person asked if you would expand on how you mentor and empower at the same time without smothering your young professionals.
Yeah, it's trust. It's a lot of trust. I can tell you, quite frankly, that everything that we are doing right now with all of the virtual program of the Duyle Leadership Experience would never have happened with me flying solo. No way. All of our programs are really run by our young professionals. You saw our advisory team. I have goals in mind. We have a very stated purpose. I know my team members and our leadership board share that, as do our numerous community members. And I have to entrust in them, which is pretty easy to do when you see the passion that they share for where we want to go, in helping us achieve it in our programming. Quite frankly, running virtual program was not my forte. They have ushered me, given me courage to do this, and made everything better. So I think number one, it starts making sure everyone is passionate about that goal you've set, that they understand it, that everyone is also kind of clear on their talents and strengths and are very vulnerable. I speak very openly on what I don't know and what I am anxious to learn, and letting go and trusting. We do have touch bases to make sure that we're going in the right direction, because we don't want redundancy, rework, and we want to stay efficient in our practices. But it is really having clear, open lines of communication in the process, and that I have utmost trust, and you will too, if that they understand and subscribe to the overarching goals and share your passion. They're going to help you get along the way, even though their ways may be very different than what you're used to, and you're stepping outside of your comfort zone, which I do on a daily basis. I remember our first DLE virtual breakfast club. I didn't sleep the night before because I didn't understand how the technology worked. I was fearful that my computer was going to die. I had all this trepidation, and everyone's calming me down and helping me through it. And I know this programming wouldn't have happened that we are doing on a daily. We have a DLE workshop tonight on career literacy that we're running with more than 50 people, and moderated, run by our Millennial Advisory Board members. So they share the passion. They want to make us go in some new directions. Let's go.
Great. I have someone asking, what networking opportunities or professional development recommendations do you have for more entry-level administrators? They find it difficult to find things for non-directors or high-up level leaders. Most offerings are geared towards them, and what do you suggest for the more entry-level positions? Well, I just want to point out that came from Michelle, who is also on our advisory board. So thanks, Michelle.
You may want to talk about it. The DLE, you're part of it, Kaylee. I mean, and these are programming at no charge. Would you say that's a great opportunity for networking? It's all dynamics.
I've met so many people in every different area of their career path at DLE networking events, whether it was the networking events that were at the retreat or breakfast club or culture chat. My network, and I would say even my friends, have grown immensely because of that programming. And I've also been to other networking events where I've been the young professional who's on the outskirts of the chamber night or another event and kind of feel a little out of place because no one seems to want to talk or have my opinion. So I would say if people are a little nervous about being around all those high-level directors, definitely start out at an event like a DLE event where it's a lot of young professionals who are in the beginning of their career and looking for maybe next steps in development before getting to that high-level director position.
And then through that, you're going to meet, as Kaylee mentioned, you're going to meet other people who may be involved in other organizations that have opportunities that you can now be invited to, that aren't part of where you work, that are maybe in a different industry, which is super, super, super for you. I'm a big subscriber to, I mentioned my example with my alumni association. If you are a college graduate with an active alumni association network, they are wonderful, wonderful for just uniting people at all levels of the spectrum. I mentioned the virtual call that I was on, the networking last week. We had someone who was I think they were a 2019 grad from Syracuse, up to somebody who had graduated in the 60s. So it was a whole spectrum. And that kind of experience and exposure to different levels of people, different industries, different vocations will help you become much more comfortable and confident when you do start actively networking.
Yeah.
By the way, LinkedIn right now. I'm just going to keep pushing LinkedIn. You know, link in with who I have in my network, and that's how you start really building that LinkedIn community that is your community.
Yeah, and we had a comment about how important the echo chamber is in making an effort to bring that conversation to the next level and it not just die with the first interaction. So how do you do that in this virtual world, and what kind of things do you bring into practice now that we don't have those coffee shop moments that you were talking about?
Exactly, and it's harder, and you really have to build in calendar time. We had a DLE workshop in April, and it was about own your schedule, about time management. And so consciously making time every single day, put it in your schedule, put it in your calendar. I'd say 30 minutes. If you want to do 20 minutes of networking time. And you can do virtual networking. And as I just said, you can do it whether it's going to be through LinkedIn, or I love that a number of members, actually it's become an increasing number of members of our DLE community, because it was put out as a challenge, are doing cold call FaceTime, where there's maybe a colleague that they worked with 2 years ago, a friend from college they haven't interfaced with in 5 years, that they're doing cold calls, FaceTiming them. And, you know, that's terrific. Right now in this COVID time, I think people are screened out, that actually a phone call becomes something more receptive. I know I'm screened out. I actually like people to say, would you mind if could we opt instead maybe having a phone call and having instead of screen time? But the point is I'm still connecting with them. So the discipline of every single day of making time to connect, put that in that template, mark that in that personal interaction plan.
All right. And then what skills do youngins value that older generations have to give in the workplace?
What was that? Youngins?
Yeah, that's what the question was. What skills do the youngins value that we as an older generation have to give?
I love it. You know, I think I know one of the things that I guess I'm in that older generation, is really helping them become confident and capable in approaching anyone at any level in terms of saying, hi, I'm Linda, nice to meet you. There is this noise chatter that I find in a lot of the millennials that, well, why would they be interested in meeting me? This is particularly true when I work in organizations doing consulting with a frontline employee with a senior level. Well, why would they want to come talk to me? Well, I think we have to help them understand you are as vitally important as the most senior level person in our organization because of your insights and what you see. And I spend a lot of time helping young professionals understand the value that they do have to offer in an organization and enlightening it. And that value makes them as important, even though maybe they've only worked there a year or their title happens to be one of the lowest titles in that organization. So I think building their confidence by helping them see that they truly add so much to an organization's success is a big role that we can play. I think also the other thing is, although I see more and more the growth of, again, before we had COVID, the growth of board games. I mean, physical board games, not board games like this. You've got a generation that now actually does like to do some old school things, and simply having conversations, talking and doing story time. I'm a fan of The Moth on NPR, doing a storytelling sessions with them, which I think older generation tends to do pretty well. Make it part of a skill that you help them build. Storytelling, another magnificent skill to help guide them with. Let me give you one more, and that's your career pathing. You know, talking about I've fallen down. I personally have I'd lost my jobs twice before I was the age of 30. Never thought that would happen in my life. So really helping, how do I recover after failure? Unexpected failure. How did I pick myself up, restore my dignity, move forward, and get a job? So learning from failure, talking about mistakes and how the zigzag of your career path went is another great, great coaching strategy for you older ones.
Yeah. I can say firsthand that I love your stories, so keep them coming. I don't have any more questions, so maybe we're at the end if you want to do one more little seed of advice that you can leave everyone with.
Yeah, so you've got that, you have that last chart in front. So first of all, I mentioned the handout. The handout's there. It's got those takeaways. I know everybody walks away, they take notes ferociously. The interaction plan template that you're going to get, my piece of advice is to keep that handy with your five or 10 other pages of notes, but at least exercise one. Get a win, exercise another. As we've invited you, and I hope you join us on Friday, DLE Breakfast Club, or even today's workshop. I think we have 1 or 2 slots still open, but take an action, discipline yourself to keep it going, get a win, and share the strategies. You're here representing an organization that employs many more people. Share strategies with those in your organization and out of the organization. And most of all, invest in that millennial talent inside and outside of your organization. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that feedback. Have an uplifting day. Good luck, NPC Day 2.
Thank you, Linda and Kaylee. What great advice. The PIP, Personal Interaction Plan. Have your own and get it going. Open-ended questions and trust. We heard so much that we need to follow up on. It is now my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Marrapese. She will speak on nonprofit diversity and inclusion, creating a workforce that reflects the communities you serve. Now, Jennifer is entrepreneurial, mission-based, and has a passion for helping nonprofits create high-functioning, inclusive cultures. She is also a force that really helps to keep us on track and keep us full. As you know, the nonprofits are 25% of the workforce in the Berkshires. So the work that is done at United Personnel is extremely important at helping us to keep our missions moving forward. And just one technical keeping point before I introduce Jennifer again is the chat option and the panelists. So in the chat, you have the option of speaking to the panelists or speaking to all panelists and attendees. We like when you speak to everyone so we can all hear you. So please make sure you check that little pull down of all panelists and attendees. Jennifer does have some slides, and she will hopefully have time for Q&A. She would like her questions in the Q&A. That's on the ribbon at the bottom of the screen, and it says put your question. That way she doesn't have to look through the chat. She can just see her Q&A right there. So with no more fanfare, I would like to introduce Jennifer Marrapese to speak on nonprofit diversity and inclusion. Take it away, Jennifer.
Okay, here we go.
Looks good.
So thank you for bearing with me. I've learned a lot through the conference so far. not the least of which including a Millennial Advisory Board member to help facilitate my session. I think that would have been a very helpful thing as well. When Liana first asked me to facilitate this session, I was really excited, but I was also very nervous. I felt a bit self-conscious about being a middle-aged white woman professing to be an expert on diversity and inclusion in the nonprofit workforce. And I kind of outed my nervousness yesterday during Maria's keynote session. So I'm going to use one of her techniques that she shared with us yesterday. And I recognize that I don't need to be the expert on diversity and inclusion in the nonprofit sector. So most of what I'm going to be sharing with you today comes from two different sources. First, in my work as Director of Search Services for United Personnel. In that capacity, I worked with dozens of nonprofits, and every single one of them, I would say, expressed diversity and inclusion as a priority in our finding candidates for them. So over the course of the last few years, I've developed some good strategies for sourcing diverse candidates. Second, while I was at United Personnel, I was invited to head up our internal diversity committee. Our CEO, Tricia Canavan, recognized a multitude of reasons that it was important for us to focus on diversity and inclusion. In part because it would make our workplace richer and would help us retain the best candidates. In part because diverse organizations perform better, and in part because it reflected our values, who we were as a company. It was just the right thing to do. Our diversity and inclusion committee had only formed about 6 months before the COVID-19 pandemic hit. And that really ground our work to a screeching halt. But I have a few lessons learned from some of our early efforts. All of this is to say that I'm still pretty new to this path. I don't profess to be an expert, but rather a fellow traveler with you all. But I do have some lessons learned that I'm hoping I can share with you this morning. And the last thing I'd like to do before we dive in is to acknowledge some of the limitations of of the format that we're dealing with this morning. I would have really preferred to facilitate this session in person and then have the opportunity to chat with my fellow panelists. But that said, I'm hoping to be able to share a few nuggets and hopefully get some feedback from you all as well. So this morning, these are the things that I'm planning to cover. First, we'll talk a little bit about the case for diversity. I'll touch lightly on this as I think this is probably a lot of preaching to the choir. We'll talk about some of the barriers. And on this front, I'll share some of the demographic data from the Berkshires and nationally, as well as talking about other more subtle barriers. We'll talk about some diversity recruitment strategies, how to recruit diverse talent. And we'll talk a bit about inclusion and retention strategies. So this slide says that diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. I look at inclusion as the second and in some ways more important half of the diversity equation, because if you're not retaining the diverse talent that you're recruiting, you're not really moving the needle in the most important ways. And then after the presentation, I'll also share some resources with you all to help you in your diversity recruitment and inclusion strategies. So setting the stage. Before we move into the meat of the presentation, I'd love to know how big a priority diversity and inclusion are in your specific organizations. And I'm hoping that PJ will be able to launch a poll and I can share the results of that poll with you all. So PJ, are you able to launch that poll?
Yep, I'll be launching it right now.
Okay, great. So, and related to this poll, I'd invite you to think about, as you think about how big a priority diversity is for your organization, what are your organization's goals? Are you achieving them? And how do you know? If you don't have any means of measuring your progress and holding yourself accountable to these goals, it's not likely that you'll be able to continue to make good progress, especially as nonprofit leaders who are often juggling a million priorities with scarce resources. Okay, so
So Jennifer, those results are coming in,
Okay, great.
and they won't publish.
On my screen. Okay, fantastic.
They won't publish until the poll runs for a little bit. So I'll share the
Okay.
results once we get it.
Okay, great. Well, then I'm going to keep moving on. So, a little bit of background on the current state. It's probably not a surprise to most of you that Berkshire County is not super diverse, at least in terms of race and citizenship status. Here's some of the data that I was able to track down. In addition to what you see here, Berkshire County also has a higher percentage of veterans than the national average. And I wasn't able to find specific statistics on other forms of diversity, such as sexual orientation, gender identity, disability status, religion, or ethnicity. And you know, as we've heard several times, the nonprofit sector is a huge part of the workforce in the Berkshires, representing 25% of the workforce. So I also have some information to share on the leadership front. I wasn't able to track down information specific to the Berkshires, but I do have some national information. Only 4% of Fortune 500 companies have female CEOs. And this statistic just floored me, that there are more CEOs named David and John in the Fortune 500 than there are women. And other protected groups fare even worse. There's one opportunity that's ahead of us on the national front, and that's something that's referred to as the silver tsunami. There are thousands of executive directors and CEOs who started in their roles in the 1970s and 80s who will be retiring over the next few years. And that's going to be a huge upcoming opportunity to diversify leadership over the next several years within our nonprofit organizations. So PJ, do you have the results in yet, or?
Not just yet. We have about 55% of the participants have responded. I'll close it out in a minute or two.
It's fine. I'll just keep rolling. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time on the business case again, but let me just share a few points on the business case for diversity and inclusion. One of them, and I know Linda just touched on this in her session as well, is that society is becoming much more diverse. And people, millennials in particular, weigh diversity in their decision on which companies and which organizations to work for. So having a more diverse and inclusive workplace will help you attract and retain the best talent. Diverse teams also report greater job satisfaction and engagement, and that leads to better performance. Diversity helps to prevent groupthink, and it really helps to promote and stimulate innovation. Diverse teams produce better financial results. They can help you gain access to new markets. And in the nonprofit sector in particular, often our missions relate to serving people of diverse socioeconomic, racial, and ethnic backgrounds. As nonprofit leaders, we also know that a diverse workforce, one that represents racial and socioeconomic diversity in our communities, makes our organizations stronger, more innovative, and more inclusive. So let's talk a little bit about workplace culture and how organizations can best support diversity and inclusion efforts. One of the first things an organization can do is to start to create a more inclusive workplace culture is to build awareness about what an inclusive culture looks like and figure out what your organization's baseline is. There are lots of workplace cultures surveys out there available online. And just as one example, United Personnel does an employee survey every year. And we asked our employees in a recent survey. Oh, great. Okay, we've got results from the poll in. So I'll take a look at those, and then we can go back to the building awareness.
So Jennifer, these are the results for all three polls. So I'll leave them up so you have them for reference. Okay.
Okay, great. So and can I move this over here? Yeah. Great. Well, so it looks like diversity and inclusion in hiring is a top priority for 45% of our organizations. So that's that's good. It's a higher percentage than I would have expected, and there's always room to do better. So that's great. Okay, so going back to the question about awareness. So United Personnel, we did an all-employee survey. We do an annual survey, and one of the things that we learned in one of our most recent surveys was that our employees really craved opportunities to get together frequently on a social basis. They wanted to do this and to meet people from other divisions and other locations. But what we also learned that one of the big stumbling blocks was holding these events outside of work hours. We had a pretty significant number of single parents and employees who had significant transportation challenges. That wasn't something that upper management was super aware of prior to launching this survey, but after receiving the results from the survey, they modified their efforts to hold these events and made sure that they were held as often as possible during work hours to make sure that we could include as many employees as possible. So just one example of how to become more aware of what employees need and implement those types of things. Another strategy is training. There are lots of different options from in-house awareness building to several month-long engagements. One of the small things we did when I was at United Personnel was to have staff take a few of the implicit bias tests. And for those of you who haven't heard of it, Project Implicit is a nonprofit organization out of Harvard University. And they're interested in exploring attitudes and beliefs that many people may be unaware of or unable to change. There are dozens of these tests that you can take online to measure the associations your mind automatically makes with respect to things like race, skin color, gender in the workplace, religion, disability status, weight, age, all sorts of things. Anyway, at United Personnel, we had all staff take one of these tests with respect to gender in the workplace. And then at one of our all-employee meetings, we had a facilitated conversation with 4 or 5 employees at each table during the meeting. Employees found it enlightening to be able to talk about the results and some of their own implicit biases. And it was a really non-threatening way to start to build awareness that we all have biases and that we can learn to, to address those biases to make our workplace more inclusive. There are lots of other training opportunities available as well, including experiential trainings offered by the Healing Racism Institute. And there's a new program that I just recently became aware of being offered by the YWCA of Boston called Inclusion Boston, which is a several-month-long program where you work with other nonprofits to create, to learn how to build trust and understanding that are needed to have really honest and authentic conversations about inclusion, develop data-driven plans, and drive organizational change. Finally, I'll share a few best practices with respect to workplace culture. First, as you go about identifying clear diversity and inclusion goals, it is important to make them a part of your organization's performance plans and tie them to compensation and advancement, particularly for leaders within your organization. Second, you pay attention to what you measure. Develop a simple diversity dashboard to see how you're doing. You can track the results you see from various recruitment channels. And you can also track how long on average you are retaining self-identified diverse staff members as opposed to non-diverse staff members, and how your overall retention rate changes as you begin to include more inclusive practices. Third, adopt an organizational diversity statement and make sure that it is crafted by a core group of influencers on the staff, not just the leadership within the organization. This is one of the things that we did early on at United Personnel, and just the process of talking about what should be in our diversity and inclusion statement was a really important galvanizing moment. It really helped us build the commitment around our diversity program. Lastly, let's get back to the issue of cultural fit, and I need to pull up the poll again to do this. So I asked the question about whether your organization prioritizes hiring for cultural fit, and 75% of you said yes. This is actually a really interesting thing, and it was sort of a light bulb moment for me fairly recently. And that was that when you hire for cultural fit, you actually really limit your ability to create an inclusive environment, because you're really hiring people who in a lot of ways are reinforcing what you've already got. So one way to think about that in a more inclusive way is to hire for cultural add. Think about what somebody can add to your culture rather than how specifically they fit in with your culture. So, okay. So as you roll out your diversity and inclusion efforts, make sure to include employees of all levels within your company on any committee or task force you form. Leadership should be represented, but so should frontline employees. And I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you include influencers, people who have social and political capital within your organization, whether they hold formal leadership roles or not. We talked a bit earlier about setting targets and measuring results as well. One of the stumbling blocks that we ran into at United Personnel in terms of really being able to make as much progress as we would have liked is that participating in the diversity committee was not really part of anybody's job description. So often urgent needs or urgent priorities would take precedence over the important work that we were doing on the diversity committee. But one thing that we did was that we set an annual schedule. Every month we had the meeting on the second Tuesday of the month, and we kept moving forward even if some of the group couldn't join us, and we kept good notes and kept everybody in the loop so that we could make slow but steady progress as we went. Now we'll talk a little bit more about specifically what you can do to attract and hire more diverse candidates. Let's start with your job descriptions. This is your primary passive recruitment tool. Most job descriptions are written in a way to exclude candidates from consideration rather than include them. They specify educational requirements, degrees, specific experience, number of years of experience, things that are really sort of arbitrary and not necessarily predictive of somebody's ability to do the job. And to make matters worse, often we find that women and people of color, non-dominant group members screen themselves out and don't apply for jobs for which they don't meet 100% of the criteria. So there are lots of studies out there that say that white men will apply for a job if they meet 60%, and women in particular won't unless they meet 100% of those criteria. So having these sort of prescriptive job descriptions really serve as a barrier to your being able to attract diverse candidates. So what should we do instead? Draft inclusive, skills-based job descriptions with gender-neutral language. You should focus on transferable skills and make the descriptions inviting so that the unusual suspects are encouraged to apply. There's a tool out there that I've become familiar with called Textio, and you can use that to evaluate your job descriptions for gender bias or for how inclusive they are and how likely they are to attract diverse candidates. And I'm also, after this presentation, going to share a few inclusive job descriptions with you that might serve as a good example for your future hiring. Once you've got an inviting job description, you should also think about your outreach. One thing you can do is network with and post your job in diversity-focused organizations. So just one example, recently I ran a search for an engineer. Diversity was a priority for the organization that was doing the hiring, and I posted the position with the National Society of Black Engineers. There's usually a fee associated with these types of postings, and I think it's the kind of thing that over time you develop traction. We didn't get a huge number of candidates the first time out, but if candidates see that over and over again you are appealing to these diversity-focused organizations, I think over time these types of strategies will help. And another strategy that I've used is to ask people I know whose networks are more diverse than mine for candidate referrals. So last summer, I helped to hire an African-American woman as an executive director of a nonprofit in Springfield. She was very involved in her church and in the Black community. And so every time I got a search after that in the Springfield area, when for a nonprofit leader, I would approach her and see if she had people in her network that she could send my way, because she had access to folks that I did not have access to. And she sent me any number of qualified candidates that were really excellent candidates, and a few of whom were actually finalists, one of whom was hired. So the other thing is that the way that you evaluate candidates might make it more or less likely that you'll hire diverse candidates. One best practice that we adopted at United Personnel was to develop a candidate rubric. Basically, we would take the job description and identify the top 10 or 12 qualities of an employee for that job, of a candidate for that job. And we developed interview questions around those top 10 or 12 qualities. That way we knew that we were scoring all candidates in the same way. One of the other best practices that I would really like to have implemented that we weren't able to do was to present candidates blindly to a client, basically with no name, no information on where the candidate came from, but that's another best practice in terms of evaluating candidates. Lastly, one more possible best practice that I learned of fairly recently that I think is a really good one, and one that we adopted on several of our searches. It's called the Rooney Rule, and it's named after a former NFL coach who helped develop this rule that the NFL was not to hire any head coaches unless they had a diverse pool of candidates, at least one person of color in the candidate pool. And this led to much more diverse hiring within the ranks of NFL head coaches. So you could adopt a Rooney Rule and basically just say, we are not going to fill this position until we have at least one or at least X number of diverse candidates in the pool to consider. So we've covered a lot of different recruitment strategies. And we've talked about diversity as being invited to the party and inclusion as being asked to dance. So how do we invite people to dance? That question in itself could take up the entire 30 minutes, but just a few thoughts here. One thing that's critically important is opening up dialogue and enabling feedback. People need to feel safe to share what will make them feel included at work. So you need to create, and this was one of the things that Linda just spoke about in her session as well, create opportunities for open dialogue and feedback. It might also be important to create opportunities for anonymous feedback through various forms of suggestion boxes or things like that for folks who might not feel comfortable sharing their needs in a more public way. You also need to foster inclusivity by inviting those who've expressed a certain want or need at work to be part of the solution. So, you know, one example, if you have employees who are asking for a nursing mother's room, include one of those employees in the design of the room to make sure that it meets their needs. Also important to foster inclusivity by creating mentoring and sponsorship opportunities, especially for those employees for whom networking and cultivating helpful relationships at work is not second nature. Once you've had the chance to start to crystallize your organization's commitment to diversity and inclusion, it's important to tell your story. In telling your story, it's important to think about who is represented, both visually and in the narrative of your marketing work. Think about the pictures that are on your website. Make sure that they represent the diversity of your staff in addition to the diversity of the clientele that you serve. Also, think about your forms of outreach. It might be important for you to have your voicemail in Spanish, or to have some of your application forms translated into Spanish. And be consistent in telling your story. Make sure that you're letting people know where you are on your diversity and inclusion journey, but be transparent and authentic about it as well. One other suggestion in terms of outreach is that you might consider having key employees within your organization involved in community events that have a diversity focus. For example, encouraging your employees to become involved in the planning of the Pride Parade or something like that. But to the extent that you're doing this, it's really important to be authentic about it. Becoming involved in another organiza's event is only meaningful if it ties somehow to your mission, and it's a sincere effort. So,
Jennifer, thank you so much. That was a wealth of knowledge and information. I know for one, I want to be asked to dance. I love that. Diversity is being invited. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Jennifer's resources and slides will be on the NPC website, so you will be able to find all the great tips she said. And once again, Jennifer, just thank you so much for that wealth of information. It is now my pleasure to introduce the third speaker in this panel series, What Access Means Now, Charles Baldwin. Charles is the program officer of the Mass Cultural Council's Universal Participation UP initiative, which provides resources for organizations seeking to develop inclusive and equitable tools for policy development and community engagement. Now, as digital content is quickly being pushed to the front, how much Zoom time do we all spend now, and GoToMeeting and all that? How are we as a sector, as the nonprofits, remaining vigilant on providing accessible information? What are we doing to make sure everyone can get and use our content? And that is what Charles will speak to us about now. Remember to use your chat. At the end, Charles, if he has time for Q&A, will use the Q&A function. So please use that little ribbon on the bottom of your screen, Q&A. And now, Charles Baldwin, What Access Means Now. Take it away, Charles.
Okay. Okay, and thank you so much for really having me in this. I know that I work for the Mass Cultural Council, which is specifically looking at the cultural sector. It is a reinvestment of our tax dollars in that sector, but I really think that the work can connect to all nonprofits because it is mission driven. I do want to take a moment to obviously thank our hosts. I also would like to thank the technical people who are working behind the scenes. There is a great assumption that we all have access to this technology that allows us to live in these virtual environments. And I know that I myself really have a rather Rube Goldberg type of situation, a DIY effort. And I work off of a tablet. And to avoid seeing my hand come close to the screen, Liana and Elizabeth and I decided that I was going to pass my slideshow off to Elizabeth. So that being said, although you won't see my hand come to the screen, you will hear me say, next slide. So, next slide. And I have I've got 20 slides in this presentation and 30 minutes to chat with you. And I think it's really important to note that each slide will have some information. Most of them have an image. I come from a theater background. I'm a narrative fellow, not as data-driven as perhaps some of my state colleagues would like. I will not be reading every slide. If people need me to describe an image, I'm happy to do that. But I will be hopefully getting imaginations and ideas percolating. I will go fairly quickly through the first 8 slides so that the subsequent 7 slides that talk about practices right now to be looking at, we can dig a little bit deeper. Then there's a final slide that will give some to-dos. I always love to give notes. It's the theater guy in me. But I also want to take a moment right now to have everyone who is listening in, watching, to take a moment and catch your breath. These virtual environments are taxing to the eyes, taxing to the back, depending on what kind of chair you are in. You might be watching this on your phone, your tablet, a laptop, or a desktop computer. So take a moment and center yourself, catch your breath, and we will go on. I think what's important about the Mass Cultural Council is that it is a cultural council, not an arts council. So the width and breadth of who we support, the creating of, the recording of, the practice of culture is what is important. And of course, that touches all of our lives in so many different aspects. Next slide. Briefly, the UP initiative, the Universal Participation Initiative, it really is rooted in ADA compliance, which is great, but mere compliance isn't really what drives me. Universal design sets a pedagogy for the work, but I like to say, and of course, it's a small program at a small state arts agency, that really by looking through the disability lens, we're looking at constructs of oppression and trying to dismantle those barriers that prevent really full participation. Next slide. And again, data. Who are we talking about? 1 in 5 Americans identify as having a disability. The rise of brain-based disabilities in our youth is increasing. Shout out to Linda and Jennifer. Jennifer mentioned, I believe, the silver tsunami. Maybe that was Linda. But I talk about the silver tsunami because age, of course, is a great disabling moment in many of our lives. And while I do not identify as a person with a disability, I do identify as old. I don't see as well, hear as well, or move as well as I used to. And those changes are real. And often when trying to convince leadership that access, and again, this is the broadest notion of access, when this is important, reminding our leaders who are often in this age group, as our boards are, our leaders are, and many of our donors, that if you have a house party at a beautiful house up in the hills, but it's 30 steps to get there, can everyone climb those 30 steps? If you're thinking about your the workforce that has been mentioned, and you're up on the 2nd floor without an elevator, you're automatically, for folks who have mobility impairments, those folks may not be able to get up those stairs. But anyway, who are we talking about? Let's just say 20% of the population. And disability is identity, is condition. It could be temporary. It's invisible, it's cognitive, it's behavioral. It's all those things as well as a medical condition. So we want to also break apart this small word, disability, and really recognize that it's about a spectrum of our humanity. Next slide. Americans with Disabilities Act, of course, is the foundation of this. I think it's important to understand the definition, but again, it's so much bigger and broader than that. And I also think it's a moment to look at the image on this screen, which is often affectionately referred to as Blue Bob in the disability movement, because of course, this icon, which is internationally recognized, is successful in that recognition, but limits people to thinking disability is often about physical disabilities, and not everyone identifies with their ability to do something or not. So that while this symbol works, there are many other compartments to unpack when thinking about disability. Next slide. Universal design, which I think is really about inclusive design. It's the intentional anticipation of a variety of people. And it also really roots the human in the environment, because it doesn't say that the human is disabled, but rather that our environment is disabling. And I like to include this picture of an astronaut in outer space, because obviously in that environment, we are all disabled, and we need intentional design for us to thrive in that space. Next slide. There are 8 goals to universal design. There are 7 practices to universal design. There will be a resource sheet that people can go to. I'm not going to go into every single one of these, but I do think it's important to recognize, again, this movement is not about one size fits all, which really can be attributed to the previous conversations that both Linda and Jennifer have had, that it really needs to be not only responsive, but aspirational. Next slide. And of course, it is about civil rights. And I think that is crucial. Ability or disability crosses through all the races and classes and genders. It is often mired in economic issues. And this lens is one that, when you really can understand equity and the need for accommodations, then you're really starting to open up yourselves and your organization to a variety of people. And as the data has shown from our previous speakers, that really this diversity is the success and the health of our system. So whether the percentage of people of a color or a race or an ability are small, the inclusion is critical. Because again, the ecosystem works best when everyone with all our variables is part of it. Next slide. All right, first things first. So this is the meat of the program. And obviously, if there are questions, please feel free to toss these out. But I will spend a little time here. The UP program, by its nature, as I said, is both responsive and aspirational. And in this current time, there has been a lot of people who just need to know what to do. And again, it's sort of this moment of trauma and alarm, and that is not to eliminate or disregard any of that. But it's also, this movement is also aspirational. There was the metaphor of the party before, being invited to the party or being invited to dance. I would go further and say it is determining the menu, knowing the ingredients, what kind of music is being played, the volume of the music. Is there a room without music? Is there room enough to dance in all the varieties of ways that people like to move? Because even movement itself is a vast vocabulary. So let's see, I do have a question, so I'm going to pause. ADA compliance and universal design have a strength of defining a baseline of expectations and opportunities for access. What do you think of using this as a model for supporting other aspects of access and diversity, equity, inclusion? What would POC compliance mean? Well, I mean, there are, of course, civil rights regulations on the books. That is important. And I do think that the idea that disability may be a middle class and white movement is something to really look at. The movement that makes it into the media is often described as, we're just like you. And I would argue that we're not like everyone else, nor should we be, and that we still have the right to participate. The United Nations has declared cultural access and cultural participation as a basic human right. And we know that the impact of health and wellness falls greater on people of color. Access to healthcare is a big issue. We've talked about jobs, so that it is important to recognize that disability itself comes in, or this notion of disability comes in all shapes and sizes. And I think that, as Judy Heumann has said, she was part of the independent living movement out of Berkeley and is still around. Watch the film Crip Camp, it's great, that the disability lens, when applied to oppression, confirms that everyone will be involved. That being said, this movement is also never done. As soon as you think you've got it, someone new with a new accommodation need may be at the door. So first things first, assessment, point of contact, coordination, budgeting. Accommodations can cost money, but what doesn't? And then communication and website. So I'm going to go right into this and we can dig a little deeper. I am trying to keep track of both the questions and the chat. So that is part of my pausing, and that would be the hand if you could see it, but I'm glad you can't. Next slide, please. All right, authentic assessment. This is about candor and honesty. Where is your organization at when thinking about the inclusion of a vast variety of people? And I use the phrase here, user expert. That is a universal design term for identifying people by their lived experience as being experts on the barriers that may be known or unknown at your organization. And so this is all part of the with me, not for me movement. And this is, you know, our status as nonprofits comes with these obligations to serve and be a part of the community. And as has been discussed before, it's not enough just to have sort of the noblesse oblige service. It really is about the inclusion of the variety of voices. And by centering marginalized voices as experts on what is working, or more candidly, what might not be working, you're going to gain a lot of experience from that. I also think that in thinking about your institution, the mission of your organization, if there are folks who are interested, want to participate, their clients, why would we want to exclude them with any purpose? There are all sorts of ways around, either around the barriers or dismantling them. And to have a plan for improvement is key. You assess, you develop the plan. Within that plan, there's plenty of time to pivot, word of the day. I like to say adapt, but to reflect on what's working and change as necessary. So this idea of the plan, I think, is really important, and it really ties to intention. As other folks have said, regular and ongoing training. This is both around education. There may be technical things that you want to learn, services that you are able to provide, but it is also about educating people on their own biases, the ways to break through those. And this, again, can be connected to the echo chamber that you're very familiar and comfortable with, and how can you actually listen and respond and participate with a variety of voices that are not your own. And access really can't just be one department. It really needs to infuse all the departments and really everything that you do. It's a top to bottom buy-in. And then lastly, I think what's really important when we're thinking about this assessment and where you're at and where you want to be is, how are you communicating both internally and externally? So whether that's marketing or touches upon development, the blog that goes out, or even, you know, the executive daily update, is it all text? Is it all through email? What are the different ways that our communication can be recognized? And in the cultural sector, This can turn into something that's visual, something that's kinesthetic. And as we think about these digital environments, how that we are living in right now, this level of communication variable is so important. Now, if we were in person, this would be a good time to get everybody up and moving. I'm a big fan of kinesthetic learning. So because we're going to dive a little bit deeper, again, shake it all out, I'm just going to trust that you're doing it. Relax the neck, move the shoulders, get a little air on yourself, and we'll move to the next slide. Point of contact. I think this is super important. Besides wanting to make sure that your staff is educated on the value, educated on the purposes that you have, so often having one person is important. So at the Mass Cultural Council, everyone has an awareness, everyone takes part of trainings, but as the central person, I can follow what's coming out of the New England ADA Center, pay attention to the different policies that are developing, try to track the developing technologies and share those with my constituents. Additionally, if there should be a problem, there's someone to come to, me. So I think of myself when I'm working with organizations as an IEP, an individual education program. But when I'm working with individuals, I sometimes think I'm a social ombudsman, wanting to connect people to resources. And as Alana has said in the chat, this is a lot. So the slides and the resources will be made available. And my contact through the Mass Cultural Council is also available. Next slide. I do like to have this image when talking about coordination of departments. This is an MC Escher image that sort of tweaks the idea of our three-dimensional reality with lots of stairs going multiple directions. And particularly now, and I laugh because, you know, in the nonprofit world, we're always talking about breaking out of our silos. And particularly now, as we're all in our own home, this is the potential for becoming more siloed is so easy. So how do we stay connected to our staff, to our volunteers, our colleagues, and what are those reasonable accommodations? So in my staff meetings, I have two things now that I yell from the back of the room. One is, don't forget captions. You know, our digital communications team is putting out everything now through social media and the website. We're relying upon this digital landscape to send our message, to inform our clients. And yet, if we're only relying upon words embedded in an image, text that goes out, we're not going to reach everybody. This could be around language, but it could also be, again, about the technical resources, about the videos that do not offer caption, and my limited hearing means I don't really hear what's going on. So this yelling from the back of the room, don't forget captions, is one yell. But the other thing that I'm often yelling, and I don't really yell, I'm just that guy in the back of the room, is pace. Because as we think about access now, and we go from one virtual meeting to the next virtual meeting, there's no coffee shop in between, there's no commute from one thing to the next. This moment to ponder and take in the information, that now needs to be scheduled in. So to keep our departments coordinated, you want to be thinking about these different ways we communicate and these different ways that we might reach through the screen to connect. I will talk briefly about budgeting, just because accommodations require intention and they might require cost. But the key thing is, what is the mission and vision of your institution? And do you want to exclude people? And then you really need to budget from the start accordingly. don't make the budget reactive, make it proactive. And I think that I won't really go into facilities, but I think about the different advisory boards I'm a part of, the different groups I sit in on. When we're thinking about coordinating our departments, we want to make sure that everyone from the volunteer to the president of the board understands why we do this and how it's tied to our mission and why it's important. Next slide. So yes, the meat and potatoes right now, everything is online. So of course, this is critically important. If your website is still old school, that becomes a problem. You want it to be responsive to my phone, my tablet, my laptop, my desktop, all of those pieces. You want to be aware of, is your website meeting Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines? That's the WCAG 2.0. This can all be gleaned offline and can be given, these questions, these ideas can be given to your IT folks. Because looking at a website and the goals being robust, perceivable, operable, and understandable, these are all contextual and they really need to be coded in a manner. One of the things that people always ask about, of course, is, what can we do on the cheap? Because no one has any money, and the economy is, going to be emerging in a very new way. But images on your website and providing alt text so that a screen reader picks it up, a description, is something that all sorts of staff people can do. Meta tags so that you are not, so that you are easily found and not getting locked into long code, so things are clean, and really thinking about languages. That I think is certainly important. One of the things I've started doing on social media for the last couple of years is using the caption under a photo as an opportunity to describe the photo. Not all my friends will be able to see the image, and so a description allows them to either have their screen reader pick it up, or if they use a magnifier, to actually see it in that manner. And then of course, always the assumptions of technology access. And I think that's super important to always remember that not everyone has this. Okay, I've got a 4-minute warning, so we're gonna go to the next slide. Next slide. Effective communication. So hold on to all of these notions. Think about the different ways that you can learn through communication. Captions, alt text, descriptive language, font, when you're talking about websites or even printed. Are you using serif or sans serif? Is there a high contrast? Is everything justified to the right or to the middle? Think about that. These next 3 slides, we can go through them quickly. These are the questions that I think for people who think about this initiative as aspirational need to be thinking about, and how are we going to come up with innovative solutions to them? Next slide. And certainly as we're thinking about the importance of third space and the development of young people, how do we get to a place where spatial and kinesthetic learning comes back to our young people? That's so important. Next slide. Also, this is based on human rights. Medical, is talking about testing and how easily that falls into an othering. And if you have been paying attention to the greater good, who gets sacrificed? And many people with disabilities can be considered less than with a quick glance, and everything needs to be decided within the context. Next slide. All right, so with these final few moments, these are the things that I think people can be looking at when starting this journey or continuing this journey on Accessed. So think about using alt text features on Instagram. It's there, ready to go. You also have Clip-O-Matic as an app that can do it. Google Meet. In fact, the entire Google platform has a lot of access features. So everyone's using Zoom, but look to Google Meet. They have audio to text captions that are generated automatically. Think about descriptive text, work with audio solutions. So if you're posting a video, YouTube itself can create captions. They need a little bit of editing, but there are other resources out there for broader, more deeper film or video makers. And I think this is nice because it really touches upon our other speakers, is this idea that perfectionism is itself a barrier. That it's not that we don't want to provide the most effective practices. We want to still strive to be the best. We want to help and amplify other folks to strive to be their best, all within this context. But if we get locked into what is perfect, we can often prevent ourselves from moving forward. And then the last note that I would say when you're thinking about all of this is bring the diversity to the table now. If you don't know if your website is accessible to a screen reader, reach out to somebody who uses a screen reader. All right. I went a little over, which is very typical for me. But thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Charles Baldwin. I thought that was really perfect. Two big takeaways I got was first things first, and reach through the screen to connect. I love that. And that's why so many of our panelists are using polling, and we're asking you to use the chat function to engage and reach through and really to connect to each other. And let's all think about this. To some of us, Zoom was, you know, a non-thing or go-to meeting, something we didn't know 60 days ago. And look at how we are now. So change is definitely possible and is definitely coming.